Hello and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. In this one we're going to be looking at our second sun. Well, not literally, but looking at the whole subject of it. Now I apologise to all the atheists out there because my starting point will be the Bible, because that's where the first note on the science of it has been written. We can start right back at Genesis 1, where the universe was formless and void. There was nothing that we can recognize anyway. Then God said, "Let there be light." We don't know what light is. The light is just the word that is used that we can semi-understand, because we know that light is more than just visible light. It's energy, it's all sorts of things, and they still haven't figured out what it is. That meant that the nothingness that was out there at some point reasonably quickly, which goes totally contrary to the Big Bang Theory, the nothingness wrapped up into somethingness, and those somethingnesses became the parts that make up our atoms. So atoms, widespread throughout the universe, suddenly came into being. The neutrons and protons came together and the electrons started orbiting. There's a certain attraction that these particles that came from nothing wrapped into something and then started to have some sort of attraction to within them that made them to start to orbit. Now, some of the atoms, as you will know if you study atomic things, have different weights to them and certain attractions as well. The more neutrons and protons and electrons you have, the more they attract together quicker. That means that very soon the solid and heavier things that were in sufficiently close proximity and abundance throughout the universe were able to glob together into, by day two, that figurative day two of Genesis, of a soup, little blobs of solid looking soup. And of course by day three there were sufficient blobs of these solid or semi-solid soupy things, semi-liquid, semi-solid, to come together, and eventually by day three they were separating into their liquid forms and their solid forms. Their solid forms are heavier, of course, and more attractive, and the liquid ones less solid and attractive, so therefore you got the separation, and the seas and the land were separated into the solid and to the liquid. However, it wasn't until day four, the figurative day four, phase four, when the gases had attracted sufficiently to form very large clouds, and even today we have clouds that are still coming together or dispersing, or whichever way the physics of it dictate to them. The logic of it is that a lot of the astronomers are recognizing that there are different sizes and phases of stars in the development. They used to think that stars were stars, just the ones you can see, but then they can now understand that there are suns that are as huge as Betelgeuse. Then when our sun is put beside it, you can't even see it. It's so huge. And you get your middle-sized stars and your little stars. Our one is relatively small. But then what they didn't realize until recently is that they get smaller and smaller and smaller until you get suns that they started giving them different names, until you get suns that are so small that they don't even ignite, they don't even shine. They're balls of gas that have come together to make a sun that doesn't shine. Then you get right down to the very small ones, of which Jupiter is, a gaseous planet. They call them planets, but in actual fact, if they're gas, they're a sun that never ignited and they're just too small. Then you get down to liquid planets, because of the planets that are pure liquid and don't have much solidity. Then you get finally down into the planets that are solid. Our planet is a mixture of solid and liquid, but and gas as well. And of course, because of the attraction of those atoms, they group together into the solids, the liquids, and the gases. And that explains how our planet is. Now, even though the planets are solid, they are not necessarily as solid as you would think. because of the forces that are in the galaxy, they're able to compress and expand depending on the forces exerted on them. And I'll talk about that in another video, about our growing planet, our small planet that used to be smaller than it is today. Getting back to our sun, as you can see, there are the large clouds of gas that accumulated together, and the medium and the smallest of ones that didn't even burn. Well, the astronomers have recognized that there are these varying sizes and varying temperatures and varying emitters of light and different kinds of light throughout the universe, and recently they've been mapping what they call brown dwarfs. Brown dwarfs are the stars that are about, I think, a minimum of 13 times bigger than Jupiter, that have sufficient mass to compress and not quite ignite. They can emit X-rays and different other invisible rays that we can't see, but not visible light. But they exist, and they're starting to plot them with their cameras that can detect X-rays and all of those. They are finding them in other galaxies and in very far away, and they are seeing a lot of situations where there are more than one sun. That's another thing. Bisolar systems, or even tri or quad, as those balls of gases came together, if the balls of gases were in sufficient proximity, if they're traveling at a speed that they can't go away from each other but not enough to attract to each other, they will continue to orbit each other and spin around each other in a sort of a funny pattern. They've identified quite a number of bisolar systems out there with their telescopes. In fact, it's starting to look like bisolar systems are just about as common, if not more common, than singular star systems. They've identified quite a few, so it's not unrealistic to think that our system is bisolar also, by having a visible larger sun that does fuse or make visible light, and one that's further out that doesn't. Now, the evidence is for that. When things came together, the balls of gas and the balls of solids all blobbed together, and they're sufficient distance apart to stay separated and start orbiting each other, as I've just explained with the bisolar systems that they've looked at. This was true, I think, of our system by day 4 of Genesis, that we had gelled enough solids, liquids and gases to then come together to the point we had one solid burning sun, a whole bunch of planets, and a smaller sun that did actually have enough mass at that time to ignite and to fuse and create light. Then those planets were doing little dances, some planets orbiting one sun, the other sun. Some might have been doing figure 8 orbits, orbiting around both of them at different times, but it was a complicated setup, I'm sure, but that seems to be the way the universe gelled, and we ended up getting our bisolar system. However, by the time we got to Noah, and there's another biblical record which has been substantiated quite a bit by writings by the Sumerian tablets and all sorts of other situations, plus the geology and geographic studies of the planet, to show that there was at some stage a big disaster where the planet changed drastically. At that point, I believe, according to the Bible, as my cryptic notes, scientific notes to look at, was that our bisolar system, the smaller sun, ran out of mass and fuel and basically went out. It then supernovaed, of course, because there's not enough force holding the sun in, and so instead of holding in, it goes, and then the light and energy that's present at the time that's burning goes out in a big blob, and then you end up with just the ball that is not burning. That final floof of energy goes out, and that rip went right through the system and created great havoc. the gravitational changed, gravity changed and everything changed, and the orbits of the planets that were orbiting the two suns changed, and then they had to reorient to orbit our one remaining burning sun, and in that process there were a number of planets that did not have a clean orbit and crashed into each other, shattered into zillions of pieces, into debris. Much of the bigger blobs of debris spun out and found either crashed into other existing planets and were absorbed, or if they didn't crash into it and did not get thrown out of our solar system, then they got captured into the orbits of the planets we have, and that's where a lot of the moons of the solar system we have came from. Debris from smashed up planets. Our moon also, I believe, was not present when our planet was made back in Genesis, and it wasn't until the flood, after the flood, that we gained our moon that came into orbit around our planet. It's of different material, different in many ways, but it also went through the growing process of the small growing planet theory, and we got our moon. And at the time of the flood, the gases that were outside combined hydrogen and oxygen to form rain and fell and increased the water volume on our planet. All those sorts of things we'll look at in a little more detail. But at the time of the extinction of our second sun was the time of the Great Flood, more or less. And then everything realigned, and all the debris that either left the planet or smashed into planets and were absorbed, or orbited planets as moons, that which was not sucked up by those three events remained as asteroids. If you look in the solar system, I, growing up, was only aware of one of the asteroid belts, the first one, and it's fairly clean and delineated because there are no planets for those asteroids to get sucked into or crash into, so they just float around as debris. They get to about 1/2 kilometre in size before they start to blob into spherical things. So you need at least 1/2 kilometre or 1 kilometre across before gravity is enough to pull them together. Interestingly, they've just had a lander land on an asteroid and found that it was gravel, lots of gravel. They're not as solid as they think they are originally. But I learned later in life that there were two other asteroid belts. One is the Kuiper belt outside of Pluto, and then there's the Oort cloud, which is spherical because it goes right around our whole solar system, and it's very sparse. That's debris from this catastrophe of the realignment of our planets. There's an odd thing that there is a gap of nothing between the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud, which is odd. This is one of the indicators that they're looking for planet X. There is probably something, I believe our second sun, between the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud orbiting, doing that dance on a double orbit, vacuuming up all of the debris that's in that orbit. That's one thing. There are also comets that do a loop. They come around our sun and loop out and go back out, and then they loop back in. What causes them to loop back in? Well, they go flying out and they orbit the second sun, which has now changed position in its orbit, and comes back in, and then the next time out it goes in circles round. So those comets are orbiting our two suns. That's other evidences that the planet X astronomers are looking at as well. And there are a number of other ones, I'm sure, that I'm not aware of or am not I'm not capable of talking about. But to me, that's enough evidence to say that how our solar system came into being, the whole universe gelled, came together, the atoms formed, then start to come together. First the solids, then the liquids, then the gases. The gases formed into the suns of varying sizes depending on the size of the clouds, and those that were big enough began to fuse and emit light and become the stars by day 4 of Genesis. Then, as time went on, our smaller sun, number 2, ran out of sufficient mass to continue emitting, fusing, and went supernova form, and our whole solar system had to reorient. Then there was a lot of crashing and banging of all the planets as they realigned to the one orbit around our remaining burning sun, and our other sun remains out there past Pluto, having some influence on our system, but not as great as it did in the beginning. Next, in another video, I want to look at how it affected our planet, in particular at that time of the Great Flood, of how what actually happened there with the extinguishing of our second sun. So it does look like we do have a second sun, that our system is bisolar.